Welcome to the Fitness Simplified Podcast. I'm Brooke Davis, women's functional nutritionist and fitness specialist with Elysian Women's Wellness, and I'm here to simplify your fitness. Today, we have on Desiree Doucet, who is a life coach who works with GenXers who are navigating the tough quirks of midlife. She's passionate about helping others in the forgotten generation use these life transitions as a springboard to grow, learn, and make changes in their lives. After working with Desiree, parents have an understanding of the growth opportunities before them. They are able to have grace, compassion, and love for themselves and others by learning to tune into their internal compass and tapping into their intuition. Clients are better able to make the best decisions for themselves, likely for the first time in their life. She uses not only her training as a professional coach, yoga teacher, and grief educator when working with her client, but she also taps into her personal experiences and the skills she's gathered along the way to help her navigate her own life transitions, including caregiving, terminal illness with family members, divorce, loss of both of her parents in her early 40s. So, first of all, I'm sorry that I can only imagine how difficult those transitions were and maybe even still are, but thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Brooke. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. So to start off, can you share just a little bit with us about what inspired you to start helping other women through this time period and maybe a little bit more about what your turning point actually was to get into it?
Oh, awesome. So what inspired me, I jokingly refer to the last 10 years of my life as the decade of doom. I have a dark sense of humor. Um,
I love it.
and
I love it. I'm so sorry, but I love it.
If you can't laugh about it, right? What's the point of life?
I always say laugh or cry.
Yeah, totally. Or both. Yeah, it's okay. Or you can laugh until you cry. Yeah. So it started, I was married and I actually lost my dad in my 20s. So that was something that was very life shifting for me. But I was like, okay, just pick up your stuff and move on, and got married. And then about a little over 10 years ago, my ex-husband's father was diagnosed with mesothelioma. And that was our first, I was like, okay, no regrets. I've lost a parent. I know what this is like. So we walked through that. Shortly after, I filed for divorce. Our marriage was in trouble before he passed, but I got some information that made it very clear that this marriage was not workable. And I was like, okay, I hate to do this, but I have to love myself more than I love him. And so went through that. I went to yoga teacher training. I was like, I am free. I'm going to start my new life. And then my mom got diagnosed with ALS. And I was like, what is this? It was not on my radar. So plunged into caregiving. That is a disease that it impacts your whole body. It's very complicated. A lot of people, medical professionals don't even understand what causes it. So my mom lived in another state and walked through that. My sister and I would trade off. And so that was a very interesting journey. Another terminal illness, very difficult journey. But I was so grateful that I had my yoga and meditation skills during that time. She passed right before COVID, went back to work. And my company was impacted by COVID. And so I lost my job. And so I sat back and I was like, what do I want to be when I grow up? This is the time. And I said, I just need some time. So 2021, I kind of took I took a couple months to figure out what I wanted to be. And what I realized is I had landed on coaching during my divorce. I just set it aside. And I was like, this is where I needed to be. So it was actually the turning point of losing my job, saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I worked in IT. I had a job I loved. I loved the people I worked with. I was passionate about what I was doing, but it was very clear that this was not my path anymore. And I had forgotten I landed on coaching in 2016. And when I figured that out, I was like, okay, here we are again. Let's pay attention this time. So ever since then, I've been working towards this new business. And the more that I talk to people in midlife, it is so evident that we're awakening. Our kids are growing up and they're like, I've poured my whole life into raising kids, being a wife, having a career. And now, a lot of us are caring for elderly parents and we're losing ourselves. And we're like, there's this wrestle with mortality when you're in midlife. You're like, when I lost my dad in my 20s, I was like, oh, that was a fluke, But when I lost my mom in my 40s, it was a totally different experience because I was like, wow, This is real. And so there's a lot of that comes up in midlife. And that's why it's so important for us to have support during this period. And the other thing that I realized a couple of weeks ago was like, that's when our health starts to take a dive, right? We can't numb with substances like we used to. We can't plow through the stress like we could in our 20s. And so like you go to the doctor and they're like, you gotta get the stress under control. You know, you are a high risk for diabetes or cardiovascular disease or whatever, right? That stuff is over. You got to get real about learning how to manage your stress, learning how to have healthy coping mechanisms, because, you know, it's been my experience that people in midlife, or they may have some of these going on concurrently or one after the other. So that's what inspired me, was my own journey. Through that last decade.
Yeah, that's a lot. I commend you for being here and using it to, to improve instead of, letting it drown you. That I can't imagine going through some of it. With what you said, in terms of health, obviously that's kind of my focus. It does have a ton of different facets, and you mentioned stress being a big one, which is, in my experience, I call it the only root cause of illness, basically, because when it comes down to it, depending on, it doesn't matter what kind of stress it is, there's tons of different kinds of stress, but it all comes down to stress on the bond, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, and so I love that you mentioned that. And then the fact that at this age, Gen Xers, 45 to like 60 or 65, it is things that you used to do in order to manage, maintain, hope, like you said, they have caught up with you at this point. Like your body is reaching a breaking point, and it's either gonna be able to handle it by your choices now, or it's going to really start to decline. And that is what most people are, they realize, I don't want to say like too late, but they realize late that these choices weren't serving them, and now they really have to make changes. So I'm curious if you had somebody in your life that was that support for you, if you were just like, that's what I needed, so now that's what I'm gonna be.
So that's an interesting question. When you get divorced, your whole social circle is rocked. So I ended up leaving my church in the middle of my divorce. Like, that was a huge support system for me. And I had a therapist who was very, very supportive. And one thing that she actually suggested to me, especially when I was walking through this stuff with my mom, because that was a minefield. She said, I suggest that you get a text thread, like with like 5 people. So choose like 5 safe people. So I had like my best friend from childhood, my best friend here in Atlanta, another good friend I met in my divorce, and like a friend from my former church, right? And I said, can I put you on this text thread with all these other people? Because when I'm having a moment, I need support in that moment. And I might not, like, you might be at work or you might be busy, right? You might be traveling or whatever. But one of those 4 or 5 people could usually respond. And that was like one of the best tactics. And that came from my therapist, because she couldn't always be there for me. So it wasn't necessarily one person, but it was a group of people. And I continue to foster those relationships. They're very important. And, because I had lost, like, my job I worked remotely, but our jobs are a huge social circle for us. When you're walking through care of someone who's sick, it impacts the whole family. It doesn't just impact the person who has the illness. So that was one thing. But then when I lost my job, I was like, I lost my social circle too. So I continued to use that group for a little bit while I was kind of getting back on my feet. But it wasn't necessarily one person, but I recognize, and I've talked to my therapist about this, how important, when I got into coaching, and when we're in coaching school, we're being coached and we're coaching others, and we're learning and growing so much that I realized there was like a missing link between therapy and implementation. And when I started adding coaching onto all of the therapy work I was doing, and then pulling in some of the yoga stuff and somatically releasing stress and learning how to get in restorative poses to reset my nervous system, like, that's when it really added fuel to the fire of my healing. So there is a place for all of these modalities. And because of my journey, I have learned so many of them. Let me help you find what works for you, right? That's kind of how I'm approaching it. So it's not necessarily that it's one single person that points you in all the directions, but if someone can be there to guide you, or you can, help you figure out what your community support looks like or the tool sets. But it's daunting because there's so much out there and we're all so different. Like one thing might work for you in anxiety and something else might work for you for stress support. You know what I'm saying?
I love that you mentioned like mind, body, soul, basically all of those components coming into it because it's so accurate, right? The role that it plays. And like I said, like, my main thing is fitness or wellness and with the body, but people don't realize how much mindset work goes into having a successful physical journey. And so with that, one of the things that you mentioned was self-sabotage and helping women navigate that. So I'm curious, among that, what are some of the most common like mindset challenges, mental components that you see coming into play, with people facing these challenges through Midlife?
Some of the typical ways that we self-sabotage is by judging things. So we can judge, like when you talk about getting physically active, staying in shape and being active, there is a lot of mindset that comes into that. So one of those things is that we'll sit there, we'll get in our heads and we'll judge. And we'll say, this is going to be hard, or it's raining outside, or it's cold. And, like that is a mindset. And most of the time at the end of whatever activity you're resisting, you're probably going to enjoy it. So there's I'm learning that sometimes the hardest part is just getting started, right? Another way that we can self-sabotage is just by avoiding things that we don't like to do or that we're judging as not fun to do. Another way judgment can come up is, by suppressing our truest expression of ourselves. So we're feeling like we have to be a people pleaser. That's another way we self-sabotage, by suppressing what is coming up for us because we're afraid of we need to be this person in order to be loved.
So one thing that I notice so often in coaching women is putting everyone else's needs above our own.
Yes.
Where does that come in? What is that categorized as?
And that can be people pleasing.
Okay.
It can also be very uncomfortable for people to sit with their emotions. So that might be part avoiding and, judging yourself. Like if I don't do this for others, then I'm not a good mom or I'm not a good wife. So they're all kind of intertwined. And the interesting thing is I am a mental fitness coach. So that means that I'm affiliated with Positive Intelligence, which was created by Shirzad Shameen. And he's distilled those 10 ways that we self-sabotage and kind of personified them. And they all come into play. And the interesting part is they all kind of live in the same neighborhood in our brain, on the left side of your brain. But the more that we're in that survival part of our brain, the more that's where our neural activity is going to go by default. And so we can change that. There's a concept called neuroplasticity, which means that we can change our brains. And my therapist had been talking to me about this for years. Neuroplasticity, you need to reprogram your neural pathways. You've been living in this survival mode for so many years. And then I found this program and I started to learn about all these concepts. And I love working through this with clients because what it leads to is you learn to shift those neural pathways to the right side of your brain. You uncover what's called your inner, he calls it your sage. That's where your creativity, your intuition lives. But what I have discovered by doing this work is that's where your true self is. And that's where you can cultivate that love. And so they're all kind of mixed up there in the left side of your brain. And so they all come into play. Like usually when one will perk up and then they'll kind of have a little bit of a party. So with the, I've got to take care of other people first. There could be the judge probably starts first and then the controller, the avoider, they can all get mixed up in there. The people pleaser. Yeah. So hyperachiever is like, I've got to do. I'm not qualified to show up. I've got to earn another degree. The hyper rational is
That
taking the emotion out of it. What, the hyperachiever?
Yeah.
The restless is jumping from one thing to another, like not being in the moment. The victim. So, oh, woe is me. Like life just happens to me. We talked about the pleaser. The stickler is like following the rule. That could be another one that I see women getting into, right? We've got to do it this way. Hypervigilant was my number one when I took the saboteur assessment when I first started this work. And that was, looking back on it, like I had just watched my mom navigate an illness that had no cure. I had just lost my job. Like I was waiting for the next shoe to drop. That is like hyper anxiety. I went on a trip to Alaska. I tell this story a lot. And I was just riddled with anxiety. I couldn't enjoy myself because it was like danger is lurking around every corner. And I was like, this is a bucket list trip for most people. Like, why can't I enjoy myself? And we talked about the avoider. So hyperachiever, hyper rational, hyper vigilant, the three hypers. So hyperachiever, just constantly achieving, I'm never good enough. Hyper rational, removing the emotion, just focusing on logic all the time. A lot of engineer tech types. I come from a tech background. Yeah. Hypervigilant is anxiety. Avoider, not wanting to have those conversations. Pleaser, we all know people pleaser. Stickler, following the rules. Restless, hopping from one thing to the next. Controller, having to have control over all the situation. And then the victim. And lastly, the judge, which is the master saboteur. So usually it starts with the judge, and the judge will judge something, and then other saboteurs will join in the party.
That yeah, makes sense. It's funny going through that, and I haven't taken the test, but I know myself pretty well, and like, oh yeah, that's me. I'm curious, is there a test somewhere that people can take for that? Where is that?
Yes. There's actually a test on his website. I have a whole PDF that I can give you the link to, to include in the show notes.
Awesome.
Where it has links to all of the tests. They're just basically links to his website, but you don't have to go searching for them.
Cool.
So there's 2 assessments available on his website. So there's a saboteur assessment, which will tell you which saboteurs are strongest for you. And then there's the PQ assessment. And that assessment just says, how much are you operating in your left side of your brain versus your right side of your brain? And where can you improve?
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. We'll throw those in the show notes. Thank you.
Okay. Cool.
Awesome. Okay. So you had mentioned mental fitness, the importance of tapping into that intuition, that internal compass. And so can you elaborate a little bit on that and really any other tools that you use to help women find balance and connect to their true selves, through this journey?
Yeah. So mental fitness is really a great tool that I love to teach people. And you can take these, I have access to this program that Shirzad created that takes people through a 6-week course that teaches them some of these concepts and the tools and techniques. And so this one, I love this one because it's so easily implemented into your life. You can use habit stacking and say, okay, when I'm brushing my teeth, I'm going to do visual PQ reps. So it's based on, I jokingly refer to it as tactical mindfulness, because if we think about being mindful, a lot of us are like, okay, well, I sit and I meditate or I journal in the morning. Well, that can go out the window when you sit in traffic, right? And somebody cuts you off and you're just like, boom, I don't have the patience for this. So what that allows you to do is first start to notice when you feel, he calls it being hijacked. When you feel that need to, you're reacting to things instead of responding, right? So the first thing is to start to notice that. The second thing is, do I want to shift? How do I do it? And so he calls, he's coined the term PQ rep, which means a 10-second focus on one sensation at a time. So you can do it visually. You can do it by hearing sounds around you. You can do it by focusing on your breath. You can do it by touch. So rubbing 2 fingertips together. Just it's a little moment of grounding by paying attention to one of your senses. But the PQ score is like basically how much are you in your left side of your brain versus your right side of your brain. So it's based on that. It's helping you shift from that self-sabotage to the sage mind. And there's 5 sage powers that he also teaches and how to tap into those as well. So if you want to deepen your practice, but the important part is first learning, being open. First, you've got to be open to, okay, let me learn about this, and being curious and be like, okay, I understand I can change my brain. I want to put in the work. I'm not happy. with where, my life is going. I see where I'm self-sabotaging, being open to those ideas that you can change, and then putting in the work to start doing those tactical mindfulness, those PQ reps during the day. And then you start to see the changes. And if you want to deepen, you can start to reflect on things. So there are 5 sage powers that you can tap into that'll fuel your creativity, your innovation, exploring. When we're in that survival mode, we're kind of closed off to other options. And so it makes life harder. The interesting thing is all of these saboteurs are just superpowers that are being taken to the extreme and being overused, right? So we learn to find gratitude for those saboteurs because they're there to keep us safe, but also say, okay, well, I see that I'm seeing the world very narrowly right now because I'm looking for threats. Let me back out of that and expand my viewpoint and get into creativity, exploring, checking in with where does this lie in terms of the entire landscape of my life? So there's like a visualization with a wiser elder self, like at the end of my life, how important is this going to be? Right. And that gives us that perspective. But it starts with us having empathy for ourselves. And the more that we grow that empathy for ourselves, the more that we can have empathy for others. So it's really a beautiful unfolding, and it really leads to so much more centering and intuitive connection with ourselves.
Awesome. The self-awareness part of it. So we teach, a component of intuitive eating. And unfortunately, part of you can't just intuitively eat and anymore. That's a whole side tangent. But right, first you have to educate yourself, and then you can mindfully navigate that. And so that's kind of what, first one, you have to be open to it. Obviously, you can't make any changes unless you realize that there's a problem and it needs adjusting and you're capable of that change. And then going into, like you said, the noticing, like feeling the impact, like that's, educating yourself on some of that. And then you can dive into, okay, how can we fix it? What can we learn from this? So very parallel processes of mental fitness and physical, which is great, of course. So, you went through a lot, obviously, before you got here and got into coaching. Given your personal experiences with the caregiving, the grief, and those other life transitions, how have these shaped your approach to coaching, supporting others? How has that played a role in what you bring to others?
I think first and foremost, I have a heck of a lot more empathy for what people are going through. I remember, so I studied with David Kessler in terms of I'm a certified grief educator, and that's a program that he offers. And I honestly did that right before coach training. And I did it partly to heal my own grief. But the thing that a lot of times I experienced this with the death of my dad. Like I would get like, oh, well, you have, people complaining about their parents. And I'm like, you don't understand what it's like to not have a parent. Like there were like I was getting into that victim mode, right? Judge came in and said, hey, they at least have their parent. And then the victim comes up and it's like, well, woe is me. Right. And so it gives me so much more empathy because one thing that David Kessler said in our program is like, nobody wants to win the struggle Olympics. Right. And I'm not out here to share my story to say, look what I went through. Right. But the complexity of the crazy stuff that the decade of doom, all the things that I went through gives me such a vast and varied experience. Like I have a family member walking through stage 4 cancer right now. And I was able to have a conversation with him and say, a client describes what she's walking through is like living in a world without gravity. She's going through a divorce. And he was like, that's a really good way to describe it. And I was able to explain some concepts to him about support and what he might be feeling. And just like, he was like, I didn't understand what you did. And now it makes sense. And so it's like meeting people in this compassionate place, giving them a connection and explaining what might be coming up helps us all just have empathy and compassion for not only ourselves, but for everybody else on this journey. I know what some of this stuff feels like. Everybody's journey is a little bit different. That's one thing I learned in coaching is, we don't give advice because we don't know what's best for someone. But having the ability to empathize and to give some perspective on what, you know, it helps me frame questions and help people explore things that they may not have seen. With my mom, it was all about creativity. Like every day was different, and she would lose, with ALS, you lose your mobility. And okay, well, today she can't button her shirt. So how are we going to figure this out? Because you want them to maintain independence there's a lot of dignity that comes into this. Like there's so much that I've learned watching other people, like going back to when I was married, and at the time my father-in-law was going through mesothelioma, like I wanted to jump in and tell him all the things. Don't eat this. You should do this, blah, blah, blah. I recognize how awful that was. Like I recognize that bad behavior in myself now, but it's only because I had gone through that journey, right? That's not what people in illness, like receiving that information. They just need us to love them, right? And so if I can take some of those experiences and help others find a way to just love on people that are suffering and love on themselves when they're suffering, that's not something that we want to admit that we're struggling. But the interesting thing is we all have these struggles. We just want to pretend or hide. We don't feel safe in order to express that. And that's another piece of that's so powerful, is being able to hold space for other people to come and be real, because it's exhausting to always feel like you have to put up a front.
Yeah. Yeah. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I lost my brother about 3 years ago, and unexpectedly. And, like you said, just having the explanation and like the labels on things of like what's going on, sorry, can just be really helpful, and knowing that you're not alone in that, and that you don't have to pretend everything's okay, because a lot of times it's not. And like you said, more often than not, people are not okay, and the things that they're going through, they do need support. And it can be, especially when you're the one giving the care, or you are having to be strong for somebody else. And so being able to have somebody there for you, I can imagine would be life-changing, right?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing about your loss. And I'm so sorry that you have walked through that personally. But those moments of connection, if we can open up and feel safe to say what we need, or to even feel those emotions, like the more that we suppress those emotions, the more they grow. So finding a safe person to express those emotions to, finding safe ways to move through those emotions and allow it to release, then we can start that healing process, and then we can show up for others in order to help them. And so we're all here navigating this difficult, journey as a human being. It's like the juiciness of life is in connecting with others, but we have to step into that. We have to dip our toe into that vulnerability pool in order to do that. But there's so much value if we have the courage to do that, which is, bringing in Brene Brown stuff. So all of this stuff is so intimately tied together, and it can help us lead such a rich life. Like even when my mom was navigating this terminal illness that was horrible and stressful and everything, it felt like a fire all the time. We had moments of joy and connection. Her last birthday was incredible. And we knew we were on borrowed time. And I remember that the hospice nurse, my mom had an incredible hospice nurse, and I will forever sing his praises. And he sat me down one day and he said, y'all are living for these moments of joy, these little bitty moments. That's what you're living for right now. I was so grateful to have those. I didn't have those. Like I lost my dad suddenly. That was a very different grief experience. But if I can sit with a client and say, explain some of the things about how our losses shape our grief journey. And losing someone suddenly it may feel different, and the emotions might show up a little differently. Whereas when my mom passed, it felt like I describe it as my dad passed from a massive heart attack, very much linked to stress, which is very tied into what I do, right? He was in his 50s. But I also believe stress was the underlying cause of my mom's illness. Like she had 2 kids going through very difficult divorces when she got diagnosed. And I don't think that that's necessarily a coincidence. And so learning to, goes back to learning to manage this stress is going to help us be more healthy for our family. But then also, it's going like our life journey is going to shape who we become. And we can take these difficult opportunities, even the joyful ones, and learn and grow from them and connect with others and have such a richer experience.
This is also valuable, I feel like, to everybody. I'm so grateful that you're here sharing all this with us. In light of that, can you walk us through a success story of one of your clients who was able to transform their midlife experience with your guidance and using these tools?
So I had somebody that I walked through their first holiday season without their parents. They lost their parents within like 6 weeks of each other last fall. And yeah, we worked through some, like, what are your family traditions going to look like this year? And what do you want them to look like? And how do you honor their memory? So that was really, really awesome work with a client. I've also helped another client who was in burnout, and she was just like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I've worked at the same job for 20 something years, helping her find her way of what are my skills? How can I apply that to a new position? I've had other folks who were diagnosed with a serious medical condition that started to impact their life, and accepting what that new life was going to look like. And, just working through those feelings of acceptance. So it's been, kind of all over the board with the different journeys. But I think a lot of people are afraid to work with people in grief. Grief is part of any transition that we have in life. Even retirement can have some grief. Your children growing up and moving out of the house, to go to college has grief. And so being able to frame everything in terms of, well, how is grief showing up, and how can we heal from that? How can we grow and learn? What do you want to draw? What is drawing you forward into the next phase in your life? But how can we honor, those feelings and glean those lessons? I love kind of figuring out how people can shift their perspective, learn and grow from those situations.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And like I said, I feel like so valuable to, I mean, quite literally everybody, not just, midlife. I'm not quite midlife yet, but I feel like I have gained some definite value from this conversation. So thank you very much, Desiree. So you offer free discovery calls. You have a free ebook, which is 10 ways to reconnect with yourself, as well as a 3-month group coaching program, which is Uncover Your Inner Sage. I will link those in the show notes. Is there anything you want to just kind of blurb about those offers real quick?
So the 10 ways to reconnect with yourself is just a simple little, 10 simple, they're mostly free things that you can do if you feel disconnected from yourself to start. It starts with awareness, right? So being aware that I don't feel something is missing, right? So there's just 10 simple, this is a way to, reconnect with yourself, journaling, sitting out in nature, and why that calms your nervous system. The 3-month journey to your inner sage is that positive intelligence, but I add on some additional coaching and opportunity for additional learning. Because what has happened is I'll take people through the standard program that Shirzad offers, and at the end they're like, I want more. And so I've left 4 extra weeks for us to dive deep into, what do you guys want to learn more about? Because I have deepened my learning there, and I want to show up and provide and add value. So that's why it's a 3-month journey. The other reason is because we go through this in a group. So there's 2 options. There's a group option and a hybrid option. And the hybrid option has some individual coaching where we do some goal setting at the beginning and the end. But the group option is a little bit more affordable if people are on, have limited funds. At the end of that 3-month sage journey, you will have more connection with yourself. It gives you those tools. You understand how you can integrate PQ reps into your life. You understand your saboteurs much better, and you start to uncover that inner sage.
Awesome. That sounds like that would be insanely valuable. And really, I feel like you've given people so many action steps, even just on this podcast, to really start their journey ultimately, right? And so starting with the 10 ways to reconnect and then diving in deeper. I love that. I will make sure all of those are linked in the show notes. Thank you, Desiree, so much for your time, for all of that valuable information and implementation steps to help guide women in their midlife to their inner selves.
Thank you.
If you have any questions, suggestions for future topics, or just want to chat, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram at Brooke_Elysian and Facebook linked in the show notes, or via our website, ElysianWomen'sWellness.com. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, we'd be thrilled if you could take a half second to leave us a 5-star review. Not only will you be helping others find our show, but you'll also be entered into our monthly $100 giveaway for no reviews. New episodes drop every Monday, so make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Thanks for listening. See you soon.